In 1941, Australia stood on the brink of extinction. The British Empire had collapsed in Singapore. The Japanese fleet was approaching the north coast, and the Australian army had not a single tank to defend itself. When the world said they couldn't, railway engineers and mechanics from the outback did the impossible. They forged a monolithic steel monster from scratch. This wasn't just a tank, it was a declaration of war from a people who refused to surrender. Welcome to the story of the Sentinel, the most insane armored legend of World War II. In the dark opening months of 1941, the Australian continent felt smaller and more isolated than ever before. For decades, the nation's security had rested on the comfortable assumption that the British Empire's fortress at Singapore was an impregnable shield against any northern threat. But as the Imperial Japanese Navy swept across the Pacific with terrifying speed, that shield began to shatter, with the fall of Singapore appearing imminent, and the British military overstretched on the battlefields of Europe and North Africa. Australia suddenly found itself staring across the ocean at an encroaching storm, standing virtually alone. The tactical reality was grim. The Australian Army was a force designed for infantry operations and light reconnaissance. It possessed almost zero armored capability. If a Japanese invasion force landed on the beaches of Queensland or the Northern Territory, they would be met by soldiers on horseback or in light trucks, facing off against Japanese Type 95 Heigo and Type 97 Chiha tanks. To the generals in Melbourne and Sydney, the math was simple and terrifying. Without tanks, Australia was defenseless. Desperate cables were sent to London and Washington, pleading for armored vehicles. The replies, when they came at all, were blunt. Britain had none to spare. America was rearming for its own survival. Australia would have to wait. And waiting was not an option. If you're watching this from somewhere far from Australia, pause for a moment and imagine realizing no one is coming to help. Because that realization is exactly what forced Australia to build something the world never expected, a tank born in secrecy, urgency, and defiance. The answers from London and Washington confirmed what Australian leaders had already begun to fear. There would be no armored lifeline. Britain's factories were working around the clock just to replace losses in North Africa. American production was only beginning to mobilize, and every tank rolling off an assembly line was earmarked for U.S. units preparing for a war that now spanned two oceans. Australia was a low priority, distant and isolated, expected to hold on with what it already had. That realization triggered a radical shift in thinking. If tanks could not be imported, they would have to be built at home. The problem was that Australia had never manufactured a modern tank. There were no blueprints, no armored steel supply chains, and no experienced tank designers. What Australia did have were rail yards, locomotive workshops, and a workforce accustomed to improvisation. Men who had spent their lives repairing steam engines in the outback, welding under brutal heat, and machining heavy components with limited tools were suddenly tasked with building something no one had ever asked them to build before. The project was quietly authorized under the designation AC-1. Secrecy was essential. Australia could not afford panic, and it could not afford Japanese intelligence learning that its defenses were virtually non-existent. In industrial facilities scattered across New South Wales and Victoria, railway engineers studied photographs of British and American tanks, measuring proportions, estimating armor thickness, and reverse engineering suspension systems by eye. There were no foreign advisors. This was pure necessity-driven innovation. Steel became the first obstacle. Tank armor required a level of hardness and consistency Australian mills had never produced. Engineers experimented endlessly, melting down scrap metal, adjusting carbon content, and testing plates by firing live ammunition at them. When a slab cracked, they adjusted the formula and tried again. Every failure cost time, and time was the one thing Australia did not have. The design that emerged was unlike anything in Allied service. Instead of riveted armor, which could shower crews with lethal fragments when hit, the Australians opted for cast armor. Entire hull sections were poured as single massive pieces. This was unheard of at the time and pushed local foundries to their limits. The result was a tank that looked almost organic, with smooth curves instead of flat plates. It was heavier than planned, but far stronger than expected. Powering the machine presented another challenge. No suitable tank engine existed in Australia. The solution was almost absurd in its simplicity. Engineers coupled three Cadillac 5.8 automobile engines together, synchronizing them through a custom-built transmission. It was crude, loud, and brilliant. The combined output gave the tank surprising mobility for its weight, and allowed maintenance crews to service engines using familiar civilian parts. As the first prototype began to take shape, skepticism followed it everywhere. Some officers dismissed it as a desperation project, others quietly doubted it would ever move under its own power. Even Allied observers, when they heard rumors, assumed it would be little more than a symbolic effort. But inside the workshops, something else was happening. Pride, defiance, a growing belief that this machine didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to exist. If you've ever wondered how far people will go when survival is on the line, this is one of those moments. Because as 1942 approached, Australia wasn't building a tank to impress allies. It was building a tank to prove it would not disappear quietly. And soon, the Sentinel would roll under its own power, forcing the world to take notice of a monster no one expected. When the Sentinel finally moved under its own power, it did so in silence and secrecy. There were no press photos, no announcements, no triumphant speeches. The first trials took place behind closed gates, on rough ground normally reserved for testing locomotives and heavy industrial machinery. Even many Australian officers didn't know what was being built. Those who did were warned to keep their mouths shut. The machine that emerged looked nothing like the tanks Australians had seen in British newsreels. Its cast hull gave it a strange, almost prehistoric appearance, as if it had been carved rather than assembled. The armor curved smoothly, designed to deflect incoming rounds rather than absorb them. At nearly 28 tons, it was heavier than expected. But when the triple Cadillac engines roared to life, the Sentinel surprised everyone watching. It moved faster than planners had dared to hope. Test drivers pushed it hard, over uneven terrain, through mud, over rail embankments and shallow trenches. Suspension systems groaned but held. Gearboxes overheated and were redesigned on the fly. Each breakdown produced not frustration, but solutions. Mechanics crawled over the hull with notebooks, chalking changes directly onto the steel. This was not theoretical engineering, it was survival engineering. Then came the armor trials, live fire, point blank. British anti-tank guns were aimed directly at the Sentinel's frontal armor. Observers braced for catastrophic failure. Shells struck and ricocheted away, leaving scars but no penetration. Even skeptics fell silent. Against weapons the Japanese were likely to field in an invasion, the Sentinel could survive. Armament, however, revealed the limits of Australia's isolation. There were no surplus tank guns available. The solution was controversial. The Sentinel was fitted with a 2-pounder anti-tank gun, already becoming obsolete in Europe. Critics seized on this as proof the project was flawed, but Australian planners weren't building a tank to duel Panthers or Tigers. They were building a machine to smash light Japanese armor, support infantry, and hold beachheads. For that role, the gun was enough. What made the Sentinel truly unusual wasn't just how it was built, but who built it. This was not the product of a massive arms industry. It was assembled by men who had never seen combat, working around the clock in workshops better suited to trains than tanks. Many slept on site. Some had sons already fighting in New Guinea. Every bolt Titan carried personal weight. As production models rolled out, new variants were quietly explored. Heavier guns, improved turrets. One design mounted a 25-pounder artillery piece inside a tank chassis, a concept that bordered on madness. Another prototype tested flamethrowers for jungle warfare. Australia wasn't just copying Allied designs anymore, it was experimenting. Yet outside Australia almost no one noticed. American forces arriving in the Pacific brought Shermans in overwhelming numbers. The tide of industrial war shifted. The immediate threat of invasion faded. The Sentinel, built for a moment of existential danger, suddenly found itself without a battlefield. If you're watching this right now, pause and think about how many weapons are judged not by what they could do, but by whether they arrived at the right time. Because that timing would determine the Sentinel's fate. It was strong. It worked. And it terrified anyone who understood how close Australia had come to disaster, but history would not remember it as a savior. Instead, it would remember it, if at all, as a footnote. And that quiet erasure would begin almost immediately, as Allied priorities shifted and the monster Australia built was gently, deliberately pushed into the shadows. By the time the Sentinel reached full production readiness, the strategic landscape of the Pacific had already begun to change. The Japanese advance, once unstoppable, was slowing under the weight of American industrial power. After Midway and Guadalcanal, the fear of a direct invasion of the Australian mainland gradually receded. For Canberra, this created an uncomfortable paradox. The very success of the Allies threatened to make Australia's greatest emergency weapon irrelevant before it ever fired a shot in anger. American commanders arriving in Australia brought with them thousands of M3 Lees and M4 Shermans. They came standardized, well-armed, and backed by an industrial supply chain that Australia simply could not match. To U.S. planners, uniformity mattered more than improvisation. Tanks were not just weapons, they were part of a logistical ecosystem. Spare parts, training manuals, ammunition types, everything had to align. The Sentinel did not fit that system. Quiet evaluations were conducted. American officers examined the Australian tank with professional interest and polite distance. Privately, some admitted the armor design was impressive. Others were intrigued by the triple-engine configuration, which offered redundancy in combat. But these acknowledgments never made it into official recommendations. Endorsing the Sentinel would have meant validating a parallel armored doctrine developed outside American control. That was not going to happen. For AUS Australian leadership, this was a bitter pill. The Sentinel had been built precisely because no one else would help. Now help had arrived, and it came with expectations. Australia was expected to standardize, to integrate, to phase out its unique solution in favor of mass-produced American machines. The logic was sound, the politics were unavoidable, but the sense of betrayal lingered. Behind closed doors, Australian officers debated the tank's future. Some argued it should be deployed anyway, if only to justify the enormous effort and cost. Others feared that using a non-standard tank in coalition operations would complicate logistics and invite blame if anything went wrong. There was also an unspoken concern. If the Sentinel performed too well, it might embarrass allies whose tanks were supposed to represent the pinnacle of armored warfare. Production slowed. Planned upgrades were shelved. Prototypes that had pushed the limits of firepower and armor were quietly mothballed. Workshops that once hummed with urgency returned to locomotive repair and civilian manufacturing. The men who had poured themselves into the project watched their creations sit idle in sheds. Engines occasionally started just to keep them from seizing. Officially, the Sentinel was described as a training vehicle. Unofficially, it was a solution to a problem that no longer existed, at least on paper. Yet many Australian soldiers knew that paper assessments had little to do with jungle fighting. They had seen how equipment not designed for local conditions failed spectacularly. The Sentinel had been built for Australia's terrain, its distances, its realities. If you're still watching, take a second and think about how many innovations die not because they're bad, but because they don't align with power. Because that is exactly what happened here. The Sentinel wasn't defeated in battle, it was defeated. In conference rooms, by late 1943, the decision was effectively made. Australia would not field its own tank in combat. The monster would remain unseen by the enemy it was built to face. And in doing so, it would slip into a strange historical limbo, too successful to ignore, too inconvenient to celebrate. The Sentinel's final opportunity to prove itself came not on a battlefield, but during a series of demonstrations meant to decide its fate once and for all. In controlled trials, Australian crews put the tank through scenarios designed to mirror jungle combat: narrow tracks, steep inclines, soft ground, and sudden engagement distances. These were the environments where imported tanks often struggled. And here, the Sentinel quietly excelled. Its wide tracks distributed weight more effectively on soft terrain. The cast armor, though heavy, shrugged off impacts that would have rattled riveted hulls. Crews reported that the tank felt solid, almost reassuring, under fire. When subjected to simulated ambushes, the Sentinel absorbed punishment and kept moving. It was not elegant, but it was stubborn. A machine built with the assumption that failure was not an option. Word of these trials spread among Australian armored units. Tankers who trained on the Sentinel developed a fierce loyalty to it. They trusted it in a way that soldiers only trust equipment that has already proven itself. Many believed that if given the chance, the tank could have been devastating against Japanese positions in New Guinea or the islands beyond. Jungle warfare demanded resilience more than refinement, and the Sentinel had resilience in abundance. Yet every positive report was met with silence from higher command. Requests to deploy the tank in limited numbers were denied or delayed until the window closed. Official explanations cited logistics, spare parts, and the need for standardization. Allied forces. All of these were valid concerns. None of them addressed the deeper issue, that the Sentinel represented an independent path Australia was no longer encouraged to take. Behind the scenes, another factor weighed heavily: The United States was not just an ally, it was becoming the dominant military power in the Pacific, aligning closely with American equipment ensured access to training, supplies, and post-war support. Fielding a uniquely Australian tank risked complicating that relationship. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood it. So the Sentinel remained on home soil, its crews trained, drilled, and waited for orders that never came. Some were eventually reassigned to Shermans, carrying with them the knowledge that they were leaving behind a machine that had been built specifically for their survival. Others stayed behind, maintaining tanks that would never fire a shot in anger. As the war pushed northward and Allied forces gained momentum, the Sentinel faded from operational relevance. New threats demanded new solutions. Rocket artillery, amphibious armor, and overwhelming air power reshaped the battlefield. The moment that had given birth to the monster passed, leaving it stranded between necessity and obsolescence. If this story feels familiar, it should. History is filled with weapons that arrived at the wrong moment, built for wars that ended before they could begin. But the Sentinel story cuts deeper because it wasn't a failure. It worked. It did exactly what it was designed to do. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If the Sentinel had been built by a major power, would it have been celebrated instead of forgotten? As we move forward, that question becomes even harder to ignore, because what happened next ensured the monster would vanish almost completely from public memory, as the war accelerated toward Japan the Sentinel's existence became increasingly awkward. It was no longer an emergency solution, but it was also too capable to dismiss outright. The Australian government now faced a dilemma that went beyond battlefield utility. The tank represented something dangerous in a coalition war: independence. Allied warfare demanded unity. Unified command, unified supply chains, unified narratives. The Sentinel disrupted that narrative. It proved that a nation cut off from its allies could design and build a modern armored vehicle faster than expected, without foreign oversight. That was not a lesson larger powers were eager to amplify, so the story began to change. Official language softened. The Sentinel was no longer described as a frontline combat tank, but as a training and development platform. Reports emphasized its experimental nature rather than its combat readiness. Documentation slowed. Photographs were limited. When American war correspondents toured Australian facilities, the Sentinel was conveniently absent. This wasn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. No single order erased the tank from history. Instead, it was buried under paperwork, overshadowed by Shermans rolling off ships in endless rows. The Allied press focused on victories, on momentum, on mass production. There was no room for a uniquely Australian solution born from panic and isolation. Inside Australia, the men who built the Sentinel understood exactly what was happening. Workshops dismantled tooling, armor casting molds were scrapped, engines were removed and repurposed. One by one, the tanks were parked in depots, stripped, or quietly destroyed. By war's end, only a handful remained intact. Some officers protested. They argued the Sentinel should be preserved as a symbol, proof of what Australia accomplished when abandoned. Those voices were polite, but they were ignored. Post-war planning was already underway. Australia's future security would rest firmly under the American umbrella. Emphasizing self-reliance was no longer politically convenient. If you're still with us, this is a good moment to pause and ask yourself how many wartime innovations disappear not because they fail, but because they succeed in the wrong way. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribing helps keep them alive. Because most histories never mention what didn't fit the official narrative. After 1945, the Sentinel vanished from public discourse. It did not feature in victory parades. It was absent from museums for decades. Children learned about Shermans, Matildas, and Pattons, but not the tank their own country built under the threat of invasion. Veterans who mentioned it were often met with skepticism. A locally built tank, cast armor, 3 engines, it sounded like exaggeration. Only later would historians begin to piece together what had happened. They would find production records, test reports, and surviving hulls tucked away in storage yards. They would realize the Sentinel wasn't a footnote. It was a warning. A reminder of how close Australia came to fighting alone, and how far it went to avoid that fate. The monster had never fired a shot in anger. Yet its impact lingered quietly beneath the surface. It had proven that innovation thrives under pressure, and that history doesn't always reward those who act first, only those who control the narrative. And as we move toward the end of this story, the question becomes unavoidable. If America never mentioned the Sentinel, was it because it didn't matter? Or because it mattered too much? In the years immediately following the war, Australia entered a period of quiet realignment. The threat that had once justified the Sentinel's creation was gone, replaced by new alliances, new doctrines, and new dependencies. The Pacific was firmly under American influence, and Australia adjusted accordingly. Military planning emphasized interoperability above all else. Unique solutions were liabilities, not strengths. The Sentinel, once the embodiment of national defiance, became an inconvenience. It didn't match NATO standards. It didn't share parts with American tanks. Training manuals existed only locally. Keeping it alive meant preserving an independent armored identity, something policymakers were no longer interested in maintaining. So the remaining vehicles were slowly dispersed, some scrapped, some stripped for parts, others pushed into forgotten storage facilities. A few survived by accident rather than intention. One tank sat for years behind a workshop, slowly rusting under tarps. Another was repurposed for testing explosives, its armor absorbing blast after blast until the data was collected and the hull abandoned. These machines had been built to face invasion, yet their final battles were against neglect. Among veterans, the Sentinel became a quiet point of pride. Men who had worked on it spoke of it in reunions and interviews, often with a hint of bitterness. They knew what it could do. They had seen the test results. They remembered the sound of those engines roaring in unison. But outside those circles, the story rarely traveled far. Without combat footage or battlefield legends, there was nothing to anchor it in popular memory. Histories written in the 1950s and 60s barely mentioned the tank. When they did, it was as a curiosity, a failed experiment quickly overshadowed by American equipment. That framing stuck. Once a narrative hardens, it becomes difficult to challenge, even with evidence. Decades later, a shift began. Researchers digging through wartime archives noticed anomalies. Production numbers that didn't match the prototype. Label. Armor test results that rivaled contemporary designs. Internal memos that spoke of deployment plans quietly canceled. Slowly, a different picture emerged. The Sentinel had not failed. It had been sidelined. Museums took interest. Restoration efforts began. Rust was stripped away to reveal the smooth curves of cast armor beneath. Visitors stared at the tank, puzzled. How had they never heard of it? Why didn't it appear alongside the famous machines of the war? If you're watching this now, you're part of that rediscovery, because stories like this survive only when someone chooses to tell them again. And if you've ever wondered how much history slips through the cracks, this is your reminder. The Sentinel was not a monster because of its size or firepower. It was a monster because it represented something unsettling, proof that under pressure, nations can defy expectations and build their own salvation. And sometimes, that kind of story is easier to forget than to celebrate. But the Sentinel is no longer forgotten. Not entirely. And in the final chapters of this story, its true legacy becomes clear, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of what happens when survival leaves no room for permission. By the late 20th century, the Sentinel began to resurface, not in battle reports or military doctrine, but in quiet corners of archives, workshops, and restoration sheds. Historians who stumbled across the tank weren't looking for it. They were researching Australian wartime production, supply shortages, or rail infrastructure when they found references that didn't add up. Too many hull numbers, too many test reports, too much effort for something supposedly irrelevant. When one of the surviving Sentinels was finally restored and placed on public display, the reaction was immediate and confused. Visitors expected something crude, improvised, unfinished. What they saw instead was a solid, purposeful machine. Thick cast armor, thoughtful internal layout, design choices that made sense for jungle warfare. This wasn't desperation welded together in panic. It was competent engineering executed under extreme pressure. The deeper researchers dug, the clearer the pattern became. Australia had not built the Sentinel because it wanted to compete with Allied tank programs. It built it because, for a brief and terrifying window, it believed it would have to fight alone. That context changed everything. The Sentinel was never meant to be exported, mass-produced, or standardized. It was meant to exist quickly, reliably, and on Australian soil. This reframing forced historians to confront an uncomfortable truth about how World War II is remembered. The story often centers on industrial giants, the United States, Germany, the Soviet Union, and their ability to overwhelm enemies through scale. Smaller nations are remembered for bravery, not innovation. The Sentinel disrupts that hierarchy. It proves that innovation didn't belong exclusively to those with massive factories and endless resources. It also explains why the tank faded so thoroughly from international memory. Celebrating the Sentinel would have complicated the post-war narrative of Allied unity and American industrial dominance. It would have highlighted how close Australia came to abandonment and how little assistance was available when the threat was most acute. Those are not comfortable stories to elevate during alliance-building years, yet among Australians, the Sentinel has slowly reclaimed its place, not as a weapon that changed the war, but as a symbol of resolve. It represents a moment when survival demanded action without permission, when engineers became armor designers overnight, when a nation refused to accept vulnerability as destiny. If you're still watching, take a second and think about how many innovations exist only because someone believed help might never come. Those moments rarely produce neat victories or famous battles. They produce machines like the Sentinel, powerful, overlooked, and deeply human in their origins. Today, the Sentinel stands quietly in museums, no longer hidden or dismantled. Children climb onto platforms beside it, asking questions their grandparents were never taught to ask. Why did we build this? Why didn't anyone tell us? And slowly, the answers are emerging. The monster Australia built was never meant to roam the battlefield. Its true impact came later, as a reminder that history is shaped not just by those who win wars, but by those who prepare for the worst and refuse to disappear quietly. And in that sense, the Sentinel may be one of the most honest weapons the Second World War ever produced. As the decades passed, the legend of the Sentinel grew quietly, carried not by newspapers or war films, but by the memories of the men who had built it, and the historians who pieced together its story. Surviving tanks were discovered in abandoned depots, often partially dismantled or buried under rusting machinery. Each discovery sparked excitement and renewed curiosity. How had Australia, a country far from the industrial powerhouses of Europe and America, managed to produce a functioning armored vehicle in such a short period? The technical brilliance of the Sentinel became more appreciated over time. Its cast hull, designed to deflect shells, remained a marvel of engineering. The triple-engine configuration provided redundancy few contemporary tanks could match. Its suspension allowed it to navigate the harsh Australian terrain, and its armament, though modest by modern standards, was sufficient for the tasks it was designed for. Scholars now understood that the tank was not a flawed experiment but a precisely tailored solution to an imminent threat. Efforts to restore the Sentinel began in earnest. Museums and military heritage organizations recognized the importance of preserving this unique piece of wartime ingenuity. Restoration was painstaking. Engineers had to reverse engineer parts that were never meant to be replaced, study original blueprints that had been partially lost, and reconstruct components that were long obsolete. But the dedication paid off. Visitors could see the tank as it had been intended: formidable, rugged, and unapologetically Australian. The Sentinel story also sparked broader discussions about innovation during wartime. Historians contrasted it with mass-produced tanks from larger nations, highlighting how necessity drove creativity in smaller countries. Where the United States relied on standardized production and Germany on tactical doctrine, Australia demonstrated that ingenuity and local knowledge could produce something uniquely effective. The Sentinel was a testament to human resourcefulness under pressure, proving that great machines are sometimes born not from abundance, but from constraint. Public interest grew. Documentaries, articles, and museum exhibitions began to explore the tank's origins. Veterans shared first-hand accounts of the grueling hours spent assembling it, the intense testing phases, and the pride in seeing the tank move under its own power. Children learning about World War II began to hear a story that was often missing from traditional histories, that of a nation that refused to surrender, building a weapon that reflected its determination and resilience. If you're watching this story, take a moment to imagine the courage it took. Men who had never seen combat, working with limited resources, created a tank that could have changed the outcome if it had been used in the moments it was most needed. And yet, story initially ignored it. How often do we overlook innovation simply because it doesn't fit the broader narrative? The Sentinel, now restored and displayed, stands as a symbol. It represents more than steel and engines. It embodies ingenuity, determination, and the spirit of a nation facing overwhelming odds. And though it never saw the battles it was built for, its legacy is profound. A reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are in creation itself, and the courage to act when the world doubts you. Even decades later, as historians study World War II, the Sentinel quietly teaches a lesson. that heroism can take many forms, and sometimes survival requires more than courage on the battlefield. It demands vision, creativity, and the audacity to build a monster no one thought possible. By the end of the war, the Sentinel had quietly faded from operational relevance, yet its story was far from over. While the Sherman tanks and Matildas took center stage in military history books, the Australian monster remained largely invisible to the world. Its engines, cast armor, and ingenuity were preserved only in the memories of its creators and the scattered depots where the few surviving machines rested. The post-war period saw Australia realign its military strategy with its new allies. The need for standardized equipment, interoperability, and shared logistics made the Sentinel's unique design impractical for active deployment. But those who had built and trained on it never forgot its capabilities. For them, the tank represented not just metal and mechanics, but resilience, creativity, and national determination in the face of imminent threat. Over the decades, interest in the Sentinel grew among historians, engineers, and military enthusiasts. Slowly, restorations began. Museums and private collections sought out the surviving hulls. Today, visitors can see the Civ tank, marvel at its innovative design, and understand the context in which it was created. A nation on the brink, forced to innovate or perish. Its legacy is more than technical achievement. It's a story about human ingenuity under pressure. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest contributions go unrecognized, not because they failed, but because they didn't fit the dominant narrative. The Sentinel stands as a symbol of what can happen when a people refuse to surrender, when they act decisively in the shadow of overwhelming danger. If you're watching this now, remember, the most remarkable inventions aren't always celebrated immediately. Some wait decades to be appreciated, hidden until history finally catches up with their brilliance. The Sentinel was one of those inventions, a monster forged from necessity, bravery, and Australian determination, now finally earning its place in the annals of World War II history.